I am Thomas Bowles, Ag Agent from Prince William County, and I am for the soil, for the future, and for the planet.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee. Our episode this week is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. John Galbraith, professor at Virginia Tech School of Plant and Environmental Sciences, and Eric Bendfeldt, who's an extension specialist for community viability with Virginia Cooperative Extension. I have to confess that I learned a lot from these two gentlemen during this conversation. Did you know that Virginia Tech has won the national championship for soil judging 6 times? Yeah, when it comes to soil judging, Hokies reign. We'll also talk about gleaning, which not only can help resolve food insecurity in Virginia, but improve the health of your soil. Let's go to the show. Welcome once again to For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee, and we are fortunate today to be joined by 2 guests, Professor John Galbraith, professor with the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech, and also Eric Bendfeldt, a specialist for community viability with Virginia Cooperative Extension. And gentlemen, in our last conversation we had in our previous podcast, we talked a lot about the diversity of soil types here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Dr. John Galbraith, if you had to start a farm today, you, John Galbraith, and you were going to grow corn and soybeans, what area of Virginia, I'm curious, would you like to start a farm with those specific crops?
Well, I think I would base my decision on the experience that our farmers have right now. The river terraces that are found in the coastal plain, and of the major rivers that drain from the Valley and Ridge province across the Piedmont and then are deposited in the coastal plain, that's where I would choose, because it has the right climate, it has the right soil conditions, and river terrace soils have no physical limitations to rooting. And so I think I would pick one of the river terraces, and also I would look for a soil such as the state soil, the Pamunkey series.
Eric Bendfeldt, I'll start off this podcast with the same question to you. And you not only have a lot of expertise in soil health, but community viability. And community is everything when it comes to selecting a home and a farm. But where would you farm?
Jeff, as you know, I actually live in Rockingham County in the central Shenandoah Valley. So it's always hard not to prefer home, but thinking about the geology here and how the soils were formed in the Shenandoah Valley and its history, I would also have to say that I would start a farm in the Shenandoah Valley area. But overall, we're quite blessed in Virginia that we do have so many soil types. And even within that, Jeff, I do think as you talk with more and more farmers, that when they're starting off, incorporating a good cover crop mixture in to get the health moving, encouraging the biology of the soil. So I do think you can start with a good resource, but then I think it's also important to follow good principles and good practices as well.
Very well. And of course, in our last podcast, we talked a lot about the diversity of Virginia soils. And one thing I wanted to bring up in this podcast with Dr. John Galbraith, understand, Dr. John, you're involved with the Virginia Tech soil judging team. Is that correct?
That's right. I've been fortunate enough to be the coach here since I arrived in 1999.
Now, I know we have a lot of Hokie fans that listen to this podcast. A lot of them follow, football, baseball, basketball, but we probably have a lot of fans of the soil judging team, because I know they are very competitive nationwide.
We've been fortunate. We really have wonderful, wonderful students, and and they give up their own personal time. They join the team and they come out to practice. They don't get any class credit for it. They don't get paid for it, and they don't get their expenses paid. But that they're willing to invest their time and their resources in it because they enjoy it. So we do. We've had good success. We won 6 national championships and finished second 5 times as well.
For those of us who are not familiar with the competitive side of soil judging, explain in layman's terms how it works. Is it one university against another university or a series of universities? How does that work?
It's interesting because it's a lot different. I equate it to March Madness in the fact that the regional level, there's about 64 teams that began competing, and then only about 25 of those teams qualify for the national championship contest. At that contest, though, it's a free-for-all. Rather than being 2 teams matched up against each other, it's a series. All of the teams compete at one time, and then the results are found out. So it is quite competitive. You practice for a week and then learn some soils, and then we have the contest on 2 days following that.
Well, congratulations on the success of the Virginia Tech soil judging team. And I know that it's got to be an educational experience if you're getting into agriculture or horticulture.
It really is what they call experiential learning, because the students have to apply what they've learned in all of their classes, whether it's agronomy or geology or hydrology or soil science, and they have to put all of that together, and they have to use their judgment out in the field. And there's a physical component to it as well as a mental side of it, and so it's really the most educational experience that I can give them. And the biggest pleasure is getting to know the students one-on-one and being available to answer their questions, not just about agriculture, but about life in general when we go on these judging trips together.
How important is that all farmers do a soil test on a regular basis?
Well, I think that's very, very important. So one thing is to find out what your baseline is, especially if there's no existing records, is to find out the baseline for the soil pH, and then the available nutrients and micronutrient levels. And the soil test is the way to do that. And I think these things change over time, and it's a good way. You can also request the organic matter content in the report as well. And by tracking that, you can see how your soils are responding over time. So you can follow the organic matter percent in your soils and see whether your cover crops are adding carbon to the soil. And then you can, of course, maintain your nutrient levels at the proper level by checking the other fertilizer recommendations as well, and deficiencies or surpluses.
The next topic that I'd like to address is gleaning, and specifically, Dr. John, I want to ask you about the New River Valley Gleaning Network, but Eric Bendfeldt with Virginia Cooperative Extension. For our listeners not familiar with that term, gleaning, what exactly is that practice?
Well, I think if you historically, I guess for myself, if you read Bible or scripture or any historical documents thinking about different cultures, there would actually be like a code or a principle that as people were harvesting their fields, that it is a way to show both compassion and mercy for people, that they were instructed not to harvest the edges of their field, and people that were maybe suffering from poverty or misfortune then were allowed to come in and harvest the edges of those fields. I think from a biblical background, the story of Naomi and Boaz, I think that's one example of that. And then here in Virginia, we're fortunate to have the Society of St. Andrew, based in Big Island, Virginia, and that's actually one of the largest gleaning networks in the country. And I know John has worked with them in the New River Valley with their efforts, and just really neat to see how, people coming together to try to meet needs and challenges that their neighbors are having at a community level. And I know I've interacted with John, and I've learned a lot listening to his story and how the New River Valley Gleaning Network was started.
John, can you share that story?
Well, simply, there was a poll taken at our church in Blacksburg here, and the number one need for outreach that the parishioners identified was food insecurity. And so I thought of how can we do that? How can we help to solve the food needs of the people? And I started looking into the poverty levels of the people in this region, and it was surprising to me about how great the need was for food. So I started thinking to myself, now how can we supply food to people, and what kind of food should we supply? And so we focused on what was not being taken to food banks, and that was largely fresh fruits and vegetables, things with high nutrient content and just very, very healthy for people to eat. And so I started looking around for farmers that had excess food left over in their field, because so much of what we produce in this country actually wastes and never reaches the households that are in need. And so that seemed like a waste to me. So I started by looking for farmers that were willing to let us come in and harvest after they had harvested. In other words, after they had gotten their crop out of the field, after they had satisfied, their own families, their neighbors, their friends, and other people, then there was still food left in the field, vegetables and fruits. Would they be willing to let us come in and grab that and then do that second harvest and then deliver those to local food banks? And we were able to get that relationship going, and we've been doing this now for 12 years.
That reminds me of a visit I paid to a Virginia apple orchard. Oh, it's been over a year ago now, but I recall as walking through the orchard in late fall, there were bushels and bushels and bushels of apples on the ground that had maybe just a slight blemish, but still otherwise perfectly viable.
Yes, well, so that ability to come in and salvage harvest is good in a couple of different ways. Deer come in to apple orchards and eat, and then varmints, raccoons and other varmints come in and eat the apples that are on the ground. And so actually by picking up the excess apples on the ground, you're actually helping the apple orchard owner. And then also sometimes with apples late in the season, they'll have an abundance of apples still on the trees. And if a hard freeze is coming, especially an early freeze, a hard frost with moisture associated with it, the apple trees can suffer a lot of damage if those apples get coated with ice and then start to break off the bud for the next growing season. So by coming out and harvesting those apples at the 13th hour, you might say, it's actually a benefit to the apple orchard owner for the next year's production.
I'm sure that listeners of this podcast may like to get involved with a gleaning network such as that found in the New River Valley. You can just call your local office of Virginia Cooperative Extension and ask there, the extension agents, if there is a gleaning network in your own region, and that way you can get involved with the gleaning effort taking across the Old Dominion. Gentlemen, just a couple of minutes remaining in this podcast, and I know that we like to cover one of the 4 core principles of soil health. And Eric Bendfeldt, I'll ask you, which of the 4 principles would you like to cover today?
I think right now the idea of minimizing disturbance is, continuing to be important, thinking about both chemical and physical disturbance. Yeah, I think as John mentioned, the importance of soil carbon, soil organic matter, and also keeping the soil armored against weather events, heavy rainfall, like extreme hot conditions. I think having a good cover is important, and if you disturb the soil, that you can actually undo some of the work that you've done in building up soil carbon and soil organic matter. And I know a colleague often talks about the soil as a home and a habitat, and when the home is disturbed, it really takes a while for the home to recover and to rebuild what it had. And so there's so many aspects to the soil's ecosystem that rely on soil biology, the processes that are really mediated by organic matter and carbon that helps to release vital nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, as well as sulfur. So just being cognizant of ways to minimize disturbance is really important to maintain that home and make it so that recovery process isn't really severe.
Professor John Galbraith, anything you'd like to add on that? And specifically, I'd like to hear your comments about the trend we are seeing statewide with no-till agriculture.
I think no-till has been a really a conservation practice that has stood the test of time. The research that's been put into it, both all across the United States, has shown the numerous benefits of it. And then for some of the farmers, they actually can show an economic benefit as well. And so that's a win-win situation. But one thing that I've learned from my own gardening and experiences, we garden almost 1 acre of land, is that disturbing the soil, flipping it upside down, is really not beneficial at all, because it breaks open the aggregates, and it disturbs the microbes, it disturbs the earthworms, it disturbs so many things. So I know that it's necessary, but it may not be necessary on a frequent basis. And so minimizing the number of times that you flip that soil completely upside down, and then maximizing the times that you add carbon to the soil, has proven to be beneficial.
Very interesting. And I'd like to conclude this particular podcast by asking our listeners to take a pledge. I'll challenge you right now to go to the website forthesoil.org, and that is the digit forthesoil.org, and take the pledge to improve soil health in your own backyard vegetable garden, in your own farm, wherever you are connected with the Mother Earth, as they say. I challenge you to take that pledge to improve soil health. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us, Jeff. We really enjoyed it, and I hope you and all the listeners have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Yes, thank you, Jeff and John, for sharing and being part of the conversation. Really appreciate it.
For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was obtained through the Free Music Archive and is attributed to Jason Shaw and Mr. Smith. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.